It happened in the middle of the backyard, with 23 relatives watching and saying nothing. Agnes had just stepped out of the kitchen with a pot of potato salad when Frank met her at the screen door. He wasn't shouting yet. He was using that low, tight voice that Agnes had learned over 31 years to fear more than the shouting. "You took money from the family next door." Agnes set the pot down on the picnic table. Her hands were still warm from the stove. "They gave it to me. I spent 2 days hemming Patricia's wedding dress and the veil," her mother insisted. "You embarrassed me." His voice lifted then, filling the yard the way it always did when he wanted an audience. "Neighbors help each other. That's how decent people live. And you stood there and took their money like a hired hand." "I am a hired hand," Agnes said quietly. "I've been one for 31 years and I've never seen a paycheck." The slap came before anyone could draw a breath. Agnes's head snapped to the side. She caught the edge of the table to keep from falling. Her left ear was ringing. Across the yard, her sister-in-law Colleen covered her mouth with both hands. Aaron, standing near the barbecue, looked at the fence. No one moved. Frank's voice was still going. $200. You took $200 from the family next door. Do you have any idea how that looks? I went over there this morning and gave it back myself. I stood on their porch and I apologized for you." Agnes straightened up. A thin red mark was beginning to bloom along her cheekbone. "The money was mine," she said. "I earned it." "Don't," he pointed at her. "Don't you dare talk back to me in front of everyone." He turned and walked back toward the cooler like nothing had happened. That was when Yvonne came through the side gate. She had driven up from Toronto that morning, 4.5 hours, and stopped at a bakery on the way, because her mother had mentioned the night before that nobody had thought to get anything for dessert. She was carrying 2 boxes of butter tarts when she walked into the yard and saw Agnes standing at the picnic table with one hand pressed to her cheek. Yvonne set the boxes down. "Mom." She crossed the yard in 8 steps. "What happened?" Agnes shook her head. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Leave it alone." But Yvonne had already seen her father's face, the satisfied set of his jaw, the way he was already pouring himself a drink as if the whole thing were finished. She had grown up watching that jaw. She looked around at the yard full of relatives. Colleen, still with her hand over her mouth. Uncle Pete and his wife pretending to examine the garden bed. Aaron, who had not moved from the barbecue, flipping a burger with the careful attention of someone trying very hard not to exist. Priscilla, Aaron's wife, sat at the far end of the table with a paper plate in her lap and her eyes down. Yvonne turned and walked straight toward her father. "You hit her," she said, in front of everyone. Frank looked up with something almost like amusement. "You've got no idea what you're walking into. You slapped her over $200 she earned herself. She embarrassed this family. You embarrassed this family." Yvonne's voice didn't rise, which was somehow worse. "You embarrassed it the first time you hit her, and every time after, and today in front of every person you've known your whole life. The only one here without any shame is her." Frank stepped toward her. "Don't push me." "I'm not pushing you, I'm telling you. If you touch her again, I will call the police from this yard." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Colleen from across the yard let out a small, uncomfortable laugh. "Yvonne, come on, you've been in the city too long, that's all. Family business stays family business." Yvonne turned and looked at her aunt. "Every single one of you stood here and watched it happen," she said. "Not one person moved, so don't talk to me about family business." She went back to her mother, put her arm around Agnes's shoulders, and walked her inside. In the small washroom off the kitchen, Yvonne ran a face cloth under cold water and pressed it to her mother's cheek. Agnes sat on the edge of the tub with her hands folded in her lap the way she always sat, quietly, not quite taking up space, as if she were a guest in her own home. "The $200, Yvonne said. "What were you going to do with it?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Aaron called last week. He got himself into trouble with that investment, the one I told him not to make. He needs to cover close to $30,000. I thought if I saved every job I could find." "Mom." I know it's not possible, but he's my son." Yvonne crouched in front of her. "If Aaron has a problem, he comes to me, not you. You don't run yourself into the ground trying to fix something that isn't your fault." Agnes gave a small, tired smile. "He knew I'd try, that's exactly why he called me first." The gathering broke up early. Nobody seemed to know where to look. By the time the yard emptied, Yvonne had washed the dishes her mother had left. A full stack, the kind that accumulates when 23 people eat and don't think to carry their own plates to the sink. She was drying the last pot when she noticed the calendar tacked beside the refrigerator, a date circled in red pencil. Tomorrow. She stared at it for several seconds. Mom. Agnes looked up from folding tea towels at the table. Tomorrow is your birthday. Agnes said nothing. Then softly, at my age it's not really. Not one person mentioned it today. Yvonne hung the pot back up, not one. Agnes went back to folding. Yvonne made a decision. She took her mother to dinner the next evening at a restaurant in town that Agnes had once pointed to through a car window, years ago, and said nothing else about. A proper place, white tablecloths, candles and little glass holders. Agnes sat across from her daughter and spent the first 10 minutes touching the edge of her fork, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. She looked at the menu like she was reading a document in a foreign language. Order whatever you want, Yvonne said. Don't look at the prices. Agnes ordered the salmon. When the plate arrived, a clean, careful portion, something warm that someone else had made and carried directly to her, she went very still. Mom? I'm fine. Agnes pressed her lips together. I was just thinking. I've cooked salmon more times than I can count. I always made sure everyone got the fillet. I always waited until the plates came back, and then I ate the end pieces, the skin, the parts nobody wanted, so nothing went to waste. Yvonne reached across and put more salmon on her mother's plate. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. You eat the fillet, tonight and from now on. Agnes laughed the way you laugh when you're also about to cry. They talked for 2 hours. Somewhere in the middle of their second pot of tea, Agnes started telling stories Yvonne had never heard before. About being 19 years old in a church kitchen in Guelph, making her grandmother's sour cream cake for an entire congregation, about how the minister's wife told her she had real talent, about how she used to dream of running a small catering business out of her own kitchen. Something modest, something hers. What stopped you? Yvonne asked. Agnes looked at the candle. I got married. Yvonne reached into her bag and placed a small box on the table, navy blue, no ribbon. Happy birthday. Inside was a silver thimble engraved with a small leaf pattern. Agnes's hand began to tremble before she even picked it up. I found it 3 years ago, Yvonne said, at the consignment shop on Elgin Street. I recognized the engraving from Grand's sewing table. I've been keeping it for you. I didn't bring it home before because I knew it wouldn't stay on your hand for long. Agnes had sold it in Yvonne's second year of university, quietly, one Tuesday afternoon, because Frank had refused to pay the tuition bill and told her a girl going to school in the city was a waste of money that belonged to the family. She slid the thimble onto her right index finger and turned her hand slowly in the candlelight. Yvonne had to look away. When she looked back, Agnes was watching her. Come to Toronto with me, Yvonne said. Come and live with me. Agnes was quiet for a long time. Your father needs. Mom. People will say. Mom. Yvonne leaned forward. You are 57 years old. Women your age are starting businesses and traveling and beginning again from nothing. How much longer are you planning to wait? Tell me honestly, when he hits you, are you actually okay afterward? Are you? Agnes looked down at the thimble on her finger. I keep thinking, she said finally, that if I hold out a little longer, things will settle. You've been thinking that for 31 years. A long silence. Let me think about it, Agnes said at last. This isn't a small thing. She didn't need long. 3 days after the backyard gathering, Frank came home from a meeting with Aaron and announced at dinner that Yvonne should contribute to Aaron's new truck. She can afford it, Frank said, not looking at Agnes. She's been at that job long enough. Agnes said, no. Frank looked up. No, she said again. What Yvonne has, she earned. Aaron figures out his own problems. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Agnes had heard in years. She heard the chair scrape, that particular sound she had dreaded for 3 decades, and she made herself stay still. The blow knocked her sideways. She caught the edge of the counter. When she straightened up, her lip was bleeding. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and looked at the blood for a moment. Then she looked at Frank. I want a divorce, she said. The pressure came quickly. By the next morning, Colleen was at the kitchen table. Aaron was pacing in the hallway. Pete had left 3 voicemails. By noon, there were 4 people in the living room, all with the same basic message in slightly different tones. At your age, this is foolish. Think about what people will say. Think about your son. Think about everything he's given you. Agnes sat in the middle of the room and let them finish. Then she said, "Not one of you was in this house when he burned Yvonne's acceptance letter because he said girls don't need university. Not one of you was at this table when he poured my savings out onto the counter and counted every dollar in front of me and kept it. I have cooked every meal and apologized for every outburst and ironed every shirt for 31 years. Has any one of you lived a single day of that for me? Can any of you go live it now in my place?" No one answered. Every person in that room found something on the floor to look at. Frank, from the armchair in the corner, said, "You'll be back within a month." Agnes looked at him. "Then I suppose you'll find out." She moved to Toronto. Yvonne's apartment was small, and the pull-out in the office wasn't meant for long-term sleeping. But Agnes slept through every single night. No footsteps in the hallway. No voice finding fault at breakfast. No particular weight pressing down on the morning before it had even started. She woke at 5 out of habit and made tea, and stood at the window, watching the city light come up over the building across the street, and she let herself feel, cautiously, like testing ice, that the morning was hers. 3 weeks in, she asked Yvonne about finding work. Yvonne had been thinking about it since the restaurant. Her company had been discussing in-house catering for monthly staff lunches for months without landing on anyone to do it. She mentioned Agnes to her manager almost in passing. The next morning she got a call. Would her mother be willing to do a trial run? Agnes couldn't sleep the night before. At midnight she came to Yvonne's door and whispered into the dark, "What if they don't like it? What if I embarrass you?" Yvonne sat up. "Mom, you have been cooking for crowds since before I was born. Just make what you make for me." The next day, Agnes arrived at the company kitchen with her own apron and kept her head down while she worked. She made a pot of proper split pea soup, a roast chicken with autumn root vegetables, her grandmother's sour cream biscuits, and a tray of butter tart squares. She moved quietly between the counter and the stove and tried not to notice the way some of the younger staff glanced at her when they came through, trying to figure out why the sales manager had brought her mother in to cook. By 12:30, every dish was empty. Staff were standing around the serving table asking questions, requesting recipes, asking whether she was coming back next week. Her manager came down from the 3rd floor, shook her hand with both of his and said, "Agnes, we'd like to make this a permanent arrangement. 3 days a week to start. Come up to the office this afternoon, and we'll sort out the details." Yvonne, standing at the kitchen doorway, watched her mother receive the handshake the way she had been raised. Graciously, with both hands, her back straight. She stepped around the corner so Agnes wouldn't see her face. Back in the small town, Frank discovered he didn't know where the good saucepan was kept, or the login for the online banking, or which bin was recycling and which was garbage. Agnes had handled all of it. The first 4 things he tried to cook burned, including toast, which he had not previously thought was possible. He called Aaron. Aaron, drowning in the fallout of the failed investment, said he was too busy. He called Colleen. Colleen, who had spent 30 years watching Frank humiliate his wife at family gatherings and had never once said stop, found she was suddenly very occupied on the evenings Frank wanted company for dinner. Aaron's situation got worse before it got better. He sold his car, then his watch. He picked up a second job. Hard, physical work. The kind that left his back aching and his hands rough, the kind he had spent most of his adult life considering beneath him. One afternoon he came home to find Frank sitting at his kitchen table, having let himself in with the spare key. "I need somewhere to stay," Frank said. "The house is too quiet." Aaron stood in the doorway for a long moment. He thought about his mother, up every morning before 5, making breakfast for a man who hadn't thanked her for it in 30 years. "I'll drive you to the bus station," he said. Priscilla understood on a Wednesday. She had taken a sick day, which Frank, still finding reasons to be at Aaron's apartment, took as an opportunity to list everything she was doing wrong. The place wasn't clean enough. The groceries she'd bought weren't what he wanted. She had no idea how to run a household properly. She turned from the counter to say something measured, and Frank's hand caught her across the side of the face. She stood very still. Then she walked into the bathroom, sat down on the tile floor, and put her back against the door. She thought about every summer gathering, where she'd sat at the far end of the table while Frank shouted at Agnes. About every time Aaron had said, "That's just how he is. You get used to it." About how she had somehow gotten used to it. She thought about Agnes in her own washroom, pressing a cold facecloth to her own cheek. That evening she called Yvonne. "I think I owe your mum an apology," she said. Yvonne was quiet for a moment. "I think you should tell her yourself." Agnes came into her own the way spring comes to Ontario, not all at once, but in small, accumulating shifts that you almost don't notice until one day the ground is soft and everything is different. The staff at Yvonne's company learned her name, called her by it in the hallway, saved her the good parking spot on delivery days. A few of the younger women taught her to read the transit map. On Saturday mornings, she and Yvonne went to the farmer's market, and Agnes spent a full hour in conversation with the produce vendors about what was in season, what paired well, what was worth the price. And it was the most comfortable Yvonne had ever seen her look anywhere. She opened a bank account. The first time she held the card, she turned it over and read her own name on the front, printed clearly, belonging to no one but her. Agnes, just that. She was 57 years old, and it was the first thing she had ever owned outright. They drove back to the small town in September for her former father-in-law's remembrance service. Agnes had always respected the old man, and that had nothing to do with Frank. She wore a pale blue dress and had Yvonne help her put the silver thimble on a thin chain so she could wear it around her neck. She stood straight. Frank was in the yard when they arrived. His hair had gone white at the temples. He looked somehow smaller, in a way that had nothing to do with his actual size. He watched Agnes cross the yard to the memorial table and arrange the flowers she had brought, and he said nothing for a long time. When she and Yvonne were walking back toward the car afterward, he called after her from the end of the drive. "Agnes." His voice had changed, something flattened out of it, something that used to sound like certainty. "I figured out how to make the soup. The leek and potato one you always." He stopped. "You look well." Agnes paused. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had spent 31 years telling her that her cooking, her sewing, her $200, her whole careful life was an embarrassment to him. "Take care of yourself, Frank," she said. She got in the car. As Yvonne pulled out onto the road, Agnes rested her head against the window and watched the town that had held her whole life pass by in pieces. The old church where she had been married at 26, the consignment shop where she had sold her mother's mixing bowls, her grandmother's scissors, her good winter coat, one thing at a time over the years, quietly, so no one would know how tight things were. "Mom," Yvonne said softly, "you okay?" Agnes turned from the window. Outside, the September maples were burning gold at the edges, that particular color that only lasts a few weeks before the leaves finally let go, before everything exhales. "Better than okay," Agnes said. She meant every word of it. The car kept moving and the town fell away behind them, and Agnes did not look back.